your host. Thank you so much for going on this journey with me for the past few weeks. It has been incredibly just a great process. This has been so good. And I just thank you so much for tuning in. I hope this show has been insightful, resourceful, and educational. The goal of today's show is to stimulate genuine fact-based conversation around tough education issues that affect our community. I have a great lineup for you today. I am so excited for everyone that's on the show today, and I can't wait till you meet them all. We have Dr. Autumn Jeter, Superintendent of Bessemer City Schools, Alabama. Danielle West, CEO of Queen City Academy Charter School in New Jersey. Shavar Jeffries, Director of Education Reform Now. He's also a lawyer and civil rights activist. And we have Dr. Brent Johnson, educational professor or associate professor of education at Gordon State College. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Good to be here.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all so much for being on. And we have a great show lined up. So I just kind of want to just jump in so we can get all the questions that have been asked to us through this network out to the community as much as we get as many questions answered to the community as we can today. So we're going to start off with you, Shavar Jeffries. You're the Director of Education Reform Now, which you can give us a little background on. But obviously you think that education reform is necessary. Can you tell us why? And just give people that just don't know, they hear a lot of talk about education reform. Tell us what it is. Is it financial based? Is it smaller classrooms? You know, what is it? And just tell us about your organization. Thank you.
Well, first, thanks, Meredith. Thanks for having me, and thanks for just being the amazing leader you are. I'm honored to be here with our fellow panelists. And for us, education reform, from my vantage point, is essential because our public school system in this country really wasn't designed to educate Black and brown students well. And we know for most of the history of our country, the public education system was actually designed to segregate us and subordinate us into spaces that disallowed us from engaging in the practice of freedom and liberation. And so for me, education reform is how do we disrupt, how do we transform these systems so that actually can serve low-income students and Black and brown students in particular. And so for me, education reform really means 5 issues. One, the foundation of it is standards and accountability, that we really have high standards for our children. Particularly comes to our Black students, people can be quick to believe about what we can't do and think we're not as smart and not as talented. So we have to have very high standards, rooted in the idea that our children are geniuses, they're brilliant, they can change the world, they will change the world, but our adults got to have that belief in them. Then we got to hold the system accountable to actually deliver one type of education that'll deliver against that promise. Second, for me, is then resource equity. We know too many of our schools are underinvested, that there hasn't been the investment, not only in terms of money and dollars, but in terms of curriculum, in terms of resources, in terms of educational tools. We see COVID right now. We see so many of our young people just don't even have the internet access to make remote learning possible. So resource equity is critical. Third for us is reimagining teacher prep so we can make sure our teachers have the skills and tools they need to drive instruction for our young people from day one. Most of our teachers, about 65% in recent studies, say what they learned in graduate schools of ed didn't equip them for the classroom. Fourth for us is more choices within the public education system. We believe deeply that Black and brown parents should have more options. They know their children best. They know the ways in which their children learn best, and they deserve options. Middle class people and the wealthy already have options. We want low income folks to have them too. And then finally, higher ed reform. We need reform in terms of access. We have too many colleges that have legacy preferences, fundraising preferences, the way they use early decision that make it harder for qualified students of color to access. We have colleges that are not affordable, so we got to have more investments so that college is affordable for our young people. Then we have to hold our colleges accountable too. We have some colleges that are basically dropout factories where less than 25% of people graduate, so we got to hold them accountable as we make more investments. We got to see those numbers go up in terms of completion as well.
Wow, thank you. You hit on something, resource equity. And I think I want to go to Danielle and Dr. Jeter about this. What is going on during COVID right now? How is it hard? I mean, I know it's so many issues going on right now in your school systems. Danielle, can you hit on resource equity first, and then I'll go over to Dr. Jeter?
It definitely is a challenging time. Many state budgets have been impacted. So we have seen the effects of COVID directly on our schools. However, it is a time of opportunity, I always say as well. I think it's a great time to rethink how we were doing things. So in terms of resource equity, we noticed very early on as our small charter school, as well as the charter school network or networks here in New Jersey, we've been able to see that early April, the end of October, we were able to really hit the ground running a lot different than some of the traditional public schools were in terms of making sure our scholars were equipped with devices as well as internet access. So while some districts were still up and not running come September, all of our scholars pretty much we had made sure they either had a hotspot and they definitely had a device. And if they did not have that accessibility at home, we were equipping families with that because we realized that this remote instruction, it was not going to work through just handing someone a packet and saying, complete this packet, right? We still needed to engage with families and scholars. And we did that by making sure that they had the accessibility needed to be able to communicate with them because many of our families were just not online yet. They weren't up and running. And so when we think about resource equity, I think a big piece of that and that we need to start having a conversation around is how do we make sure in the 21st century that all families have accessibility to the internet? You know, it's almost as though that needs to be a public utility today. We can no longer expect our children to be able to compete with students around the globe when they don't have access to those students and to those information highways that they need through the internet.
Dr. Jeter?
Yes, I'll jump in there as well. Thank you for having me and welcome and hello to all of my colleagues on the call. And I work in a traditional public school setting. I always have, which I love and adore and promote. But as it relates to the resource equity, COVID, when it hit for us here in Alabama, March 13th was the date that we all dismissed from school for the most part in this area. We really realized at that point, and when I say we, several of the superintendents that have been in conversation in our area, we really realized that there was an equity divide or a resource divide. You had your haves and your have-nots, depending on where you live. And as I mentioned, I work in a higher poverty school setting now, and it was disastrous for us to up and leave all of a sudden. Thankfully, we already had resources in place because we are supplied with a sufficient amount of federal funds. And so we were already a one-to-one device school system, but there were kinks in that road as well. But even deeper than that, for my school system in particular, in conversation with other superintendents and legislators, we've learned and we know now that this is bigger, this is deeper. This conversation of resource divide or equity divide needs to be a legislative conversation, and it is becoming one because those who were able to scoot right along back in March through the end of that school year, and those who had not had to wait on funding to be supplied, and then there was this hold up with China. You couldn't order resources, and the children that really need were held behind even more because you couldn't order the devices because of the governmental hold. But what we've learned, or what I've learned since we've been home for COVID, but we're back in school now, is that this conversation about the equity divide or the lack of resources for all is bigger, it's deeper. It needs to be a legislative conversation per state to ensure access to the internet to all, regardless of where you're located, and a device for all. And as mentioned, the funding is there. The federal government provided various federal funding for all school systems. It comes with stipulations, but it's been a great addition and a great help for us. It's just 2 minutes behind what we really needed it for and when.
Oh,
Right.
wow.
You know,
Go ahead, Ms. West.
I definitely agree with Autumn in terms of the legislative piece and making sure that the conversation gets started. Here in New Jersey, our legislators have also started having those conversations about the equity divide and resource divide. But I think more simplistic, also on the school level, it's our obligation to make sure that we're allocating those resources that we do have in the appropriate fashion so that they get into the hands of our families. Far too long, I think we are not doing our due diligence the way that we need to on the school system level or the school level to make sure that we're allocating towards those things that are really going to move instruction forward and give our kids access.
Now, what were some of the things, and I'm going to get to you, Dr. Johnson. Give me 1 second. I want to kind of go back to Shavar really quickly and stay here with Danielle, West, and Dr. Jeter. Shavar, you have raised billions of dollars in terms of education reform. And I hope I'm saying that right. I think I read that you've raised billions of dollars. How can smaller school systems that are still waiting on, or rural areas that are still waiting on the federal government funding, how can they touch base and get some of this money out, tap into some of these resources? I go to rural areas all the time, because I live in the South, and I was out last week passing out food boxes that I got from Atlanta and took them down to a rural area to senior citizens, because they didn't have food in their area. They don't get free food boxes like you do in the inner city. Same as with educational resources. How can we get some of that down to some of the rural Black areas, the Bible Belt, the Black Belt in the South? And that's just a question to you, Shavon.
Yeah, and so we're involved in lobbying the feds. And so, for example, we're part of the coalition that pushed the feds in the first CARES Act bill. Originally, they're going to put $3 billion on the table, and we're part of a group, and there's a diverse group. It was a whole bunch of us that pushed them to go from $3 billion to almost $31 billion. And so what we need to do is throughout the country, but particularly in the South, to answer your question, Meredith, the local congresspersons and the senators, and then frankly lobbying the governor, have to be held accountable, because a lot of those dollars went to state governors who then had a lot of discretion about how they would allocate and appropriate those dollars. And we know that oftentimes in all parts of the country, and in the South as well, that if we don't have the right representation at the state level, they'll allocate those dollars to white communities, to middle income communities, to wealthy communities, and we'll get the scraps. And so that's where we have to be organized at the local level.